Hello and welcome back to Oh God, What Now? I'm Andrew Harrison and we have big news. We're going to be demolishing the podcast studio to make way for a big, beautiful ballroom. Many podcasts have coveted this, so we've decided to do it. It's going to be happening next week. Might make the podcast a bit echoey though. On this week's edition, we had scheduled a special episode looking at Britain's descent into migration madness. How did we end up with our politics entirely dominated by the issue, with each of the main parties competing to offer harsher and more performatively cruel policies? Then, earlier this week, the Tory Shadow Cabinet Minister Katie Lam created widespread revulsion by saying that indefinite leave to remain should be retrospectively cancelled and large numbers of legally settled families should be deported to ensure the UK is culturally coherent. The Mail columnist Dan Hodges, who is possibly not on many listeners' Christmas card list, put it this way. Can we just be clear? We've now reached the point where Tory frontbenchers like Katie Lam, not Tommy Robinson, not Nick Griffin, are openly advocating the deportation of legal migrants on the grounds that we need to assert cultural purity. It's utter insanity. This is the latest in a migration policy arms race which has seen Reform propose abolishing ILR and mass deportation of 600,000 people within a single parliament. It's also seen Labour's Shabana Mahmood playing catch-up with promises to double the ILR qualification period and make it dependent on having a clean criminal record, volunteering in the community and speaking English well, standards which a lot of British people would find hard to meet. Nobody, it seems, is making the case for protecting legal migrants. So how do we get to a place where deportation proposals that got the National Front ostracised in the 1970s are now part of the discourse for serious political parties? And what can we do about it? Our guest today is Alan Manning, Professor of Economics at the LSE, former chair of the UK Migration Advice Committee, and author of the new book, Why Immigration Policy is Hard and How to Make It Better. Hello, Alan. Welcome to Oh God, What Now?
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
The right-wing press is having a bit of a field day this week with the fact that I think only the third small boats migrant to be returned to France under the one-in, one-out policy has actually just come back by small boat. Are panic stories like this part of why we get such bad migration policy?
I think that does illustrate one of the problems that we have. So, I think this sort of one-in, one-out deal, we know that if it was operating at scale, it would probably work because it's worked in other examples. The best known probably being the EU-Turkey deal sort of 10 years ago. But there are a lot of people like on the right who like the out bit of it and hate the in bit of it. And so they're trying to undermine it. And then on the other side would have people who like the in bit of it but hate the out bit of it and are also trying to undermine it.
Well, we'll come on to your diagnosis of the infernal cycle of news and policy a little bit later. Also with us, it's Oh God, What Now regular and presenter of More Jam Tomorrow, the podcast. It's Ros Taylor. Hello, Ros.
Hello, Andrew.
So you wrote a book called The Future of Trust. Has migration mania kind of affected trust in politics? I mean, politicians have been caught out for failing on it, but also they've stoked it.
Yeah, it's a chicken or egg situation, really. I think undoubtedly migration has played a part in it. It's a very difficult one because we know trust is low, but people are very much less willing to talk about why trust is low and to try and tease apart exactly why. And we don't actually have much data on that. It doesn't lend itself very well to surveys. Undoubtedly, Brexit did play a big part in it, though, because the promise of Brexit for many people was a fall in immigration. And what they did not expect was to see immigration instead go up quite substantially in the early 2020s. So it pissed off everyone. People who had wanted Brexit to do that were fed up. People who never wanted Brexit in the first place were furious with the people who had failed to oppose it effectively and stop it. And another thing is that the whole one law for us, another for them, is now a very dominant narrative in British politics. And that really reached its apex in Partygate. But it is still there and it is still rolling on as something that people feel it is a truism about the way people in Britain are treated.
So let's start with how we got here. How did our politics end up hysterically obsessed with one issue? And do our politicians even want to break out of the doom cycle? Alan, your book, Why Immigration Policy is Hard and How to Make It Better, highly readable. You say one reason you wrote it is that most existing research is useless. Can you give us a layperson summary of that?
I think a lot of the academic research is not very helpful for policy decisions because it's not really focused on what those policy decisions are. So if we give the example of work migration, we want to know what occupations should be eligible, say, for work permits. We want to know what should the minimum allowable salaries on those work permits be. There's virtually no academic research on those questions, instead of which it tends to be about things like, is immigration good or bad for wages? And that sort of very binary way of thinking about immigration as good or bad, I think is deeply unhelpful. And in the public sphere, then that very binary way of thinking also gets very polarized. So it's not just good or bad, it's great or terrible. And, that simply ends up in a really unproductive discussion.
Yeah, I checked the YouGov tracker on the most important issues facing the country, and it's really surprising how often immigration isn't number one. It's way ahead in 2015 around the referendum. It's like 71% think it's the most important issue. But then it declines really steadily, and it doesn't start rising again until sort of like 2019. Now it's back at number one at 54%. Why does it oscillate? Because you would have thought if it was a genuine, long-standing concern for people, it would be, like Bryan Adams, number one forever.
Yes, I mean, you're right. I mean, we have some of these trackers going back actually 50 years, and you're right that it's gone up and down as a salient issue. But I think actually there's some very clear patterns to when it goes up as an issue. One is that when numbers go up, when the level of immigration is higher, people become more concerned about it, and it's normally running ahead of the levels that people say that they want. And the second factor that is also linked to people's concern about it is when they feel perhaps just a feeling or perception that it's out of control. So when we get more concerns around sort of the bits that are less managed parts of migration, that asylum and small boats, but even free movement after 2004, that gave us less control over how many people were going to come here. So it's those two things, numbers and loss of control, which is when migration becomes salient.
Alan, there was a surge in migration after COVID, and of course, small boat numbers took off after 2022. With the legal migration side, how deliberate was that? Why did Johnson loosen immigration policy after Brexit when he might have tightened it, given what he must have known about the reasons why people voted for Brexit?
I mean, it was extraordinary because just to give some kind of context, the year in which net migration was over 900,000 people in a single year. That was the fastest rate of population growth outside the end of the wars when we brought huge armies back home. The fastest rate of population growth for definitely 150 years, possibly 200 years. So it was just extraordinary. And it was simply too high. And it was a consequence of a number of decisions that were made that maybe individually all looked sensible or had some argument behind them, but added up to this, and no one seemed to be looking at it. I mean, in recent weeks, I've seen Boris Johnson sort of try to provide some account for this, and he just comes across to me as someone who's just not across the brief. He was just out of his depth. The Home Secretaries at the time, Priti Patel and Suella Braverman, they would talk a lot in public. I just don't think they were doing the day job. They were really bad Home Secretaries. And the loss of trust in immigration, they are to blame for a lot of this.
I want to ask you why we get such bad migration policy, because as the book title is, Why Immigration Policy is Hard, and hard and bad are often closely related. By the way, the book is not just restricted to the UK, is it? You talk about migration policy around the world. Can you tell us a little bit about what you call the infernal cycle of immigration policy, where, tough controls make the environment harder and yet make people more determined, fear and political pressure? Explain a little bit about that.
It's a sort of a circle I talk about, so there is no start and point to a circle, so I'll just break in at one point. So, we have controls on migration policy. Migration policy just says yes to some people who want to come to the UK. It says no to other people. Our world is incredibly unequal, so the number of people who want to migrate to a high-income country like the UK is much higher than we're ever going to let in. So there are lots of frustrated migrants out there. They start trying to use the rules to suit their purposes, but that's not what we thought we were achieving through our visas. That leads to frustration about loss of control, leads to more controls, more attempts to evade and avoid them, and we keep going around the circle.
But I mean, it seems to just lead only to the ever more intense tightening of the regulations, which don't make things better, they make things worse. Is there anywhere in the world where this, they've been able to sort of use the tightening of regulation and, found that it has, created a migration system that both satisfies the voters and has an element of justice to it?
I think there are examples because for long periods, immigration hasn't been an issue both in our country and in other countries. And has been periods when there's often been quite strict controls on migration. I think our problem in recent years has actually been that, yes, the government was talking very tough on it in the Boris Johnson years, but they did the exact opposite. And that's a recipe for undermining confidence. So immigration has been extremely high in the past few years. So it's not really true to say that we've had a very tight immigration policy. We haven't. It's the opposite.
Well, we've had a tight policy outwardly, and it hasn't worked. I mean, it's important to say that in your book, you're not judgmental about you say these are a set of choices. You know, you can, if you wish, have high immigration and you can build your society around that. You can have extremely low immigration. You can also have different kinds of immigration. You talk about the Dubai model, which I don't think anybody would really want to replicate here, where you essentially have a very low paid migrant underclass, or you can have the more liberal democracy approach. I mean, is British migration policy in terms of keeping the voters happy-ish particularly bad by global comparison? Are we very bad at it?
I think the problems that we have are shared by most other high-income countries, to be honest. I don't think we're particularly bad. I don't think actually the current policies that we have on the managed bits of migration, which is work, student and family, are so bad. I think we're more or less where we should be, where we need to be, and we can look forward to a period of, hopefully, of relative stability instead of this wild boom and busts that we've gone through over the last 5 years or so.
People routinely overestimate how high illegal immigration is, and no amount of talking about the figures seems to shift that. And now we're in a situation where legal migration is already falling from the highs that we talked about, but the public don't seem to have noticed, or else they're just not bothered. So does it all come down to small boats as far as most of the public are concerned? Are all the tweaks that the government is doing to make legal migration harder, have they really got purpose, or is small boats the be-all and end-all?
I think at the moment, you're right that net migration is going to be falling, and it's falling very sharply and will continue to fall. The next set of figures will be lower. I don't think that's yet in the public consciousness. So when people are asked what they think is happening to migration, they think it's going up still. I actually think that as those numbers come down, and if they are believed, which some people, cast doubt on sometimes, that concern about that part of migration will go down. I think concern about small boats and the asylum more generally will remain if numbers remain high. I mean, I agree there's too much discussion on small boats at the moment, but I think there are also risks in going in the other direction and sort of trivializing it and not taking it sufficiently seriously. I mean, I think it's normal and natural to spend more time discussing difficult, contentious issues than things we all agree on. And this is the more difficult part of migration. And, in the last few weeks, I've heard people saying, well, it's only 5% of migration quite commonly. But that is not really, I know where that number comes from, but it's slightly misleading because numbers can be low but rising. For most of this year, it looks like numbers were going to be up 50% on the previous record year, which was 2022. Actually, in the last week or so, we've just dipped below that, so we're not going to be that. But it's going to be higher numbers than last year already. So they were rising. More generally in the asylum system, we now have 100,000 plus asylum claims a year, which we last had 20 years ago. We have another 20,000 family migration that is sort of on the piggybacking on that. So when you add that up, you're talking at more like 10 to 15%. So still a minority, but not trivial. Then when you look at actually the people who settle long term, the latest figures were something like 25% had come on humanitarian routes, not all sort of asylum and so on, and that will go up higher. So I really think if you want to beat reform on this, don't go around trivializing this problem, pretending it's a nothing. It really does undermine people's sense of control. And, people need to be on this case. And I feel that, too many people are falling for lazy slogans like the answer is safe and legal routes and making out it's all very easy if only we cared. And I think it's more complicated than that, but it is something that's more important than some people think.
So on that, taking that as an example, you're saying safe and legal routes is an easy answer and it doesn't stack up with what's really needed. What's a better way of approaching that? Because effectively, the broad understanding is that we got this huge backlog because the last government had simply stopped processing applications. And if we start processing them again and we create, as is described, safe and legal routes, that will stop the illegal routes. What's your response to that?
I think you need sort of more detail than that. So if you say safe and legal routes, so first of all, it's perfectly true. If everyone had safe and legal routes, we wouldn't see people crossing the channel. Ukrainians had safe and legal routes. I believe one Ukrainian crossed in a small boat, but nobody did. The problem is you've got to say, well, how exactly is this going to work? Who is eligible for this safe and legal route? Where are they going to apply? How is this going to work? So, for example, if you define eligibility very narrowly so that the people currently crossing aren't eligible, well, that's not going to stop them crossing. They'll still cross. If you define it very widely to definitely include all the people currently crossing, there are probably going to be loads of other people who are eligible, and then your numbers are going to be much higher. And I think, if you look at the people who are arguing for safe and legal routes and you say, well, actually, can we just see the policy detail? It's often, I feel, when I look at it, it's a bit lacking, really. And I don't want to just criticize that side because the other side is, detain and deport. And again, they're making out, it's all very easy, but it really isn't. And again, there's a total lack of, realistic policies being put forward by two prominent sides of the debate.
I mean, going back to the salience of the issue and the fact that people are so exercised about it, so angry about it, it's quite interesting that a lot of the data you find in the book that kind of contradicts that idea that people are, lots of people rather than everybody are implacably opposed to it. I mean, you found that in 2023, when British people were asked if refugees make a positive contribution, they said yes by a ratio of 60 to 25. This is not kind of blanket rejection and blanket anger about it. And it was in sharp contrast to Hungary, Germany, France, and Belgium, which found that, or where people believed that's not the case. If the British people do have the capacity to see different kinds of migrant as valid, why is the UK political scene so migrant phobic?
Yeah, so I think retrospectively rewriting the rules and taking away settled status from people who have it, I mean, that's sort of immoral, impractical, and just shooting ourselves in the foot. So I can't really understand why that's on the table. I mean, I don't think we're particularly migrant phobic in this country. The issues that we're facing are in pretty much every other European country and are often around asylum and refugees. I think the opinions on refugees in most countries broadly is people think, yes, we should offer a place of safety to people who are persecuted in the world, but that they also worry about how many we're going to support. They think the world, so many problems in the world, we can't support everyone in this country. They worry about whether some of the people coming don't have a strong claim. They probably would like to be able to pick and choose who are the people that they offer refuge to, more than is possible when you have people coming across the channel. And they also worry about the cost of it. So it's natural to worry about, this is a sort of charitable, we're offering protection to people. But when we give to charity, we worry about who we're giving it to, how much we're going to give, and so on. And, the labour market outcomes for refugees in Europe, even once they're qualified as refugees, is extremely poor. And so, we don't have great estimates in this country, but other countries like Australia, it's always costing more money than we're getting in terms of financial benefit. So in narrow financial terms, it's not going to be a positive. Of course, we're not doing it for our wallet. We're doing it because we feel it's right.
You also found that it's kind of not true that all high income countries naturally want lower immigration. I mean, there are some that have a majority in favour of more immigration, but large minorities in Australia and Denmark think immigration is too low. I mean, is there a case to be made in this country that actually we need more immigration?
I mean, there are examples in which that is, the case that more people want more immigration than less, but that is not the normal pattern in most countries, in most periods over 50 years. Generally, when asked, people are unhappy about how high immigration is. I mean, I think, we're going to have immigration, full stop. We're also going to have controls on immigration, full stop. What should the level of immigration be? Well, I think the first and main effect of immigration is that it increases our population, affects our rate of population growth. Personally, I think we should perhaps be thinking about increasing our population growth by 1/3% a year. That then begins to constrain how much migration we have. I think if you have very high population growth, that causes a lot of challenges. We've got to increase all our infrastructure as these new population arrive, have them houses, they've got to have machines at work and so on. So when we had population growth of over 1% a year after Boris Johnson's policies, that was simply too high. We could not have that on a sustainable year-on-year basis. So we had to have policies that brought it down from that level.
And yet the debate seems to be framed in terms of stopping it. We've heard phrases like net zero immigration bandied around on the right, which is economically unrealistic and seems impractical, yet it's part of the conversation. And you talk about the cycle of the debate being kind of driven by the fact that firstly it's too binary. You're either absolutely pro-immigration or absolutely anti. Anybody who wants to talk about balance gets drowned out. It's polarized. So, I mean, you found a book called Melting Pot or Civil War, as if these are your only choices. It's either an absolute must. There's no place in between. And it's all about seeking blame rather than solution. I mean, do we have a problem with the debate around migration more than we have a problem with migration itself?
I think the book, is called Why Migration Policy is Hard. So there are reasons why it's difficult. And this is connected to the fact that more people are going to want to migrate than we're going to admit. That is, I think, the realistic situation. But it's also called And How to Make It Better, because I think it's hard, but we make more of a mess of it than we need to. And I think it is about this binary, polarized debate. So we often end up, sort of dehumanizing migrants. Obviously, on the right, we have people demonizing migrants. But also on the left, I mean, something I wrote in the book and I worried a lot about was saying that actually on the left, you have people almost treating migrants as superheroes and heroines. And then after the book goes to press, Zach Polanski, his first article in The Guardian is not on green issues, it's on migration. It's called Migration is Our Superpower. And I think, thank you, Zach. I was right to, that it doesn't make any sense. Migrants are just people. They're just mostly some saints, some sinners, mostly just ordinary people.
Ros, I mean, this does bring us right back to current British politics. We've got reform set in the agenda with a very clear, pretty xenophobic policy. The Conservatives trying to outbid them and Labour trying to catch up. This is quite new to British politics because the main parties used to set themselves against extremists and use them as examples of what to avoid instead of following them. How do we end up here?
We've talked a lot of this podcast about Labour's communications problem, and that is one of the main root causes. I mean, Labour has struggled to explain what it wants to do for the country, apart from the abstract idea of growth, which is great, but how? It's struggling to turn the economy round. And so attention switches then to the almost intractable problem of small boats. And small boats really are, economists talk about wicked problems, and they are such a wicked problem. They're a nightmare because unless you can stop them setting off in the first place, which we are struggling to persuade the French to do for all kinds of reasons, there is no way to stop them that doesn't make it more likely that people drown. And, migrants themselves know that. And that is, I think, almost at the root of the problem here. The left is anxious, and rightly so, not to act in a cruel way. But they don't have an answer as to how to stop people setting off in small boats in the first place. And Britons, I think, generally find it hard to understand why anyone would risk their lives to come here because, a certain percentage, and not inconsiderable, of people who get on small boats drown as a result. But of course, we know these people are desperate and they hold life cheaper than we do because of where they come from and their experiences. And there is an escalation of cruelty, therefore, in people's minds. As migrants put themselves at more and more risk to come here, the reaction is to be crueler to them. You hold your life at small price, so do I. And when you start thinking like that, you start thinking, right, we need to have boats pushing back the small boats. We need to have all the inverted commas solutions that Nigel Farage talks about in very little detail, because he doesn't really want to be tackled about what would happen if we did that and more people would drown. And that's what would result. And so this is why it's such a powerful issue. And Alan mentioned the Channel earlier as well. It's fascinating the way that the Channel has historically been. I mean, you see it in Richard II, for example. It's seen as the ultimate defence against war, invasion, and now illegal immigration. And as Alan was saying, it now isn't. Now, in fact, not so very long ago, a lot of people were crossing the Channel in lorries, but we didn't notice them. It wasn't visible in the same way. And of course, the numbers have gone up a bit since then, but it has been a problem. But there is something psychologically in the British, and especially the English, that sees the Channel as protection, and the Channel has ceased to be protection. And I think that is at the root of the horrible discourse that we see around small boats.
These ideas of Katie Lam, who I'd barely heard of until last week, they're not really about migration. They're about the kind of ethnic and cultural mix of the UK. She's talking about deporting 5% of the UK's legal population, which is more than Idi Amin did when he cleansed Uganda of Ugandan Asians. It just seems insanely cruel. Why focus on indefinite leave to remain? But, as Alan just said, rewriting the rules in retrospect is not something we've ever really countenanced.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that's really happened in Britain, although you could argue that EU citizens who came here before Brexit have very much had the rules rewritten. I think there is also implicit in her argument the idea that people who want to stay here should seek citizenship, and indefinite leave to remain is a sort of halfway house where you haven't properly committed to Britain. I think that's why she thinks it's okay, and I think she hasn't really been very well interrogated on this. And, would we be granting these people citizenship? And, should they have to do that? I would argue no.
I mean, you would lose indefinite leave to remain if you've ever claimed benefits, which could mean maternity pay and parental leave, which people have claimed in good faith, or if you earn less than £38,700, which is well above the average salary. No health worker would reach it. Stephen Bush in the FT wrote, if you're in the UK, have indefinite leave to remain, have worked in the UK all your life and have paid into the UK pension scheme, unless you're one of the very wealthiest pensioners, you will lose your indefinite leave to remain. I mean, Alan, I wanted to ask you, as I mentioned earlier, that there is a kind of one of the core beliefs is follow the rules and you'll be okay. And in fact, many of the objections to small boats as well, they're not following the rules as set out. Does this kind of idea have any purchase in the UK? It seems contrary to the way we've set ourselves up.
Personally, I would be surprised if people thought that you can take away settled status from people who have already got it. I just don't believe that will end up as being a vote winner with most people. There are other questions about for new people coming in, what should be the rules for settlement, and I think we should be prepared to change those rules. And then there's a particular issue which actually doesn't get discussed very much around the people who came in the sort of Boris Johnson period and what will be happening to them when they get ILR, and in particular the impact on social care. But our public discussion simply doesn't figure in there. It's not down in that level of detail.
I think practically speaking as well, you have to ask yourself, so you're going to do this with any semblance of law and order, then there are going to be enormous numbers of legal challenges. If you're not going to do it with any semblance of law and order, if you're going to do what's happening in America with ICE and so on, and you're just going to, round people up and put them on planes out of the country, well, that the whole prospect is so insane and terrifying.
You're literally lots of words and I fully understand. Yeah, I mean, it's like, and it's also I find the contrast sharp between the kind of people who are immediately against digital ID because we're not a show us your papers country, an objection which has got a, can be interrogated a lot, but the people tends to be people on the right say we don't want these things, but they're quite happy for constant state intrusion on people that they don't like, as if it would be part of government policy. What I find particularly noxious about it is this idea that it's all for cultural cohesion, and whatever that is. I mean, we are an enormously, and always have been, a heterogeneous, multiply conquered, immigration-shaped country. And also, why should we want someone else's idea of cultural cohesion? Culture is something that emerges organically, isn't it?
I think the right is scrabbling around for a term that says some people don't integrate how we want because they're from different cultures, they're from different religions, and they don't really want to say that out, and they don't want to be actively racist, so they start talking about things like cultural cohesion. We saw a similar thing over the summer where people were, while there were some people who were putting out flags, Union Jacks and English flags, because they genuinely felt patriotic about Britain and thought this was a good chance to show it, there were other people who were using it as code for, I want to crack down on immigration.
Well, it's actually more than that, isn't it? It's not I want to crack down on immigration. It's I want to get rid of the brown faces out of my neighbourhood who may have lived there for generations. It's not.
In some, I think there is a whole range of emotions around this, and it will range from people who are explicitly and vilely racist to people who just feel that too many people arrived in the last 5 years, and that there is no one homogenous group there. People have quite nuanced views on immigration, although they do change, as Alan was saying, depending on how many people have recently come into the country.
I mean, when Katie Lam said there's a large number of people in this country who came here legally, but in effect shouldn't have been able to do so, they will need to go home. Anybody over 40 remembers "go home" as the refrain of the National Front, right? And we all we know the word that used to go before that, because I used to see it scrawled on bus shelters and shouted in playgrounds, and it was disgusting. The idea that this would be resurrected, I mean, do you think this has got any future as part of the British political debate?
Well, I hope not. I worry, given how much the Overton window has shifted in recent years, that it will, and that Farage, for once, it will be Farage following the Conservatives rather than the Conservatives following Farage, because this is more extreme than what Farage has been suggesting. This policy came so out of the blue, and I mean, there's a suggestion that Kemi Badenoch herself wasn't really aware of it.
But she has endorsed it, hasn't she?
Well, sort of,
Yeah.
but clearly, I mean, Katie Lam was freelancing to a large extent, and the party itself is definitely not wholly at ease with this policy. It came pretty much out of the blue, and then for a couple of days it was all over Blue Sky and left-wing media, but the mainstream media, to be honest, did not cover it. I think partly because they were so taken aback and thought, what on earth? They took a while to catch up, and as a result, Labour's own response, I think, never very fast, was slower than usual, and they took a while to come out and say and point out what a horrific idea it is.
It seemed to be like missing an open goal. I mean, one Labour MP who didn't want to be named told the Huffington Post, "What is the point of us saying we're anti-racist when we fail to call out racism? Not only are we cowards, but we're incompetent as well." And you would have thought this would be an opportunity for something I mentioned earlier in the podcast that maybe we can come on to. Why is nobody standing up for the existing migrant population and people who are going to follow the rules? It just seems they're just trapped in this business of outbidding one another.
There are people who are trying to do it. I think Labour knows how sensitive this subject is, and they are desperate to get the wording right on it, because they want to appear both tough on migration, but also they want to still appear compassionate and appeal to that side of the party. And having to rapidly articulate a response that is subtle enough to achieve that while also being punchy is actually not that easy, and especially under the demands of the incredibly fast news cycle that we have now. And there are also Labour MPs, of course, who are terrified that reform is making strides in their seats. They didn't really expect to be having to articulate this. They were hoping that when they came into power, they would be rebuilding Britain and talking about much more positive stuff. And they really just don't want to wade in because they worry about reform exploiting it. And of course, at one level, that's cowardice, but another level, it's also, they can also see it as pragmatism. Labour's relationship with immigration is really complicated and really interesting. I mean, it's historically, Labour has been tougher on migrants than the Conservatives, and that's what people don't expect, because the Conservatives talk tough, but they don't actually act tough because they want a ready supply of cheap labour, often from abroad. if you look back at Jeremy Corbyn, I think the main reason Jeremy Corbyn was, let's say, unenthusiastic about the EU was freedom of movement. He genuinely, whether he believed that freedom of movement should be open to everyone and not just restricted to white people in Europe, or whether he believed that freedom of movement fundamentally undermined the labour market in the UK and cut wages, he still wasn't keen on it. And the unions aren't keen on it either for the same reason. This is a very interesting and big difference with the Greens, because we've seen Zach Polanski coming out and saying a lot of things that would normally appeal to the Corbyn wing of the party. But on migration, this is a big difference, and it will be interesting to see how that develops.
Okay, we've heard about the problem in detail. What, if anything, can politicians or Joe and Josephine Public do about it? Are we stuck on the infernal cycle, or is there any way off it? I mean, Alan, the second half of the title of the book is "And How to Make It Better." Given the febrile political environment, what is the most important move the government should be making now on migration policy?
On the managed part of migration, so work, family, students, the rules around migration there, I think actually they are broadly in the right place. So numbers will be coming down. I think they'll probably level out at broadly sustainable levels. There are some things I would do a bit different. I would put more emphasis on, in family migration, on language.
So what would that mean? Sort of in the sense, limiting family migration or clarifying it?
Well, at the moment, if you want to come in, say, as a spouse, you need to have a level of English, which is what's in the jargon A1, which is a very low level. And then if you want to stay, you have to get better over time. But I think there are arguments for saying that actually, if we are concerned about integration, language, a common language is the one practical thing we can do. So I think you could think about asking for a higher level of language competency to allow family migration. So I think on the managed part, they're right. I think on the sort of who's allowed to settle long term, the ILR question, I think they're sort of general principles that settlement should be a privilege, not a right. That if we offer you settlement, you should have contributed something to us. I think those broad principles are actually broadly right. And I think most people would agree with them. I think where I sort of part company with them is that they've been very vague about exactly what that means in practice. And I think that's a mistake for two reasons. I mean, the first politically, because we're in a situation where people are very quick to think put the worst spin on what you say. I mean, going back to what Ross said earlier, you've got to be very careful with choosing your words. And so this they've just not chosen their words very well. So that's about the comms issue. And secondly, being vague makes a lot of people feel very anxious. I've had people at work saying, well, how will this affect me? And I tell them, as I deeply believe, is this will not affect you for all the noise and out there. When it comes down to it, this will not affect you, just as there were people, EU citizens, who were worried post-Brexit vote that they were going to be forced to leave. And at the time, I would have said, I don't think this is what's going to happen. And the EU settlement scheme wasn't perfect. But at the same time, it wasn't, I don't think it was terrible either.
But isn't there a serious political problem for Labour if they take this route, which is if you say, yes, our immigration policy is going to be tough and firm, you'll always be able to be outbid by people to the right who can be tougher and firmer, even if it's not coherent, even if it's not going to work. That there is another route where you stand up, and I think part of that's in your book, where you make the case for why immigration is A, inevitable, and B, beneficial, but must be managed. You don't take an open borders position. And for me, just as somebody watching the politics of it, I look at Shabana Mahmood saying increasing the qualification period from 5 to 10 years just seems needlessly, performatively cruel. And it doesn't involve any argument for, and this is why it's beneficial to have, the right, correctly managed immigration.
So I think that you don't have to be continually driven to the right, because I think most people are actually in the middle. They recognise that we're going to have some migration, but it's going to be managed. And so there comes a point at which people will think we are broadly in the right position with a certain level and so on. So that's what I would say. I think on the 10 years, I mean, again, I think they've said 10 years, but not if you've made a contribution, not being very clear about what that contribution involves. They've mentioned various things, but it's not quite sure whether it's one of the above or all of the above. And, that's about their messaging being really very poor on this. And I think that's a mistake. I think we will find out that after the consultation and the decisions that, for example, doctors and nurses in the NHS will be getting settlement after 5 years as exactly as they are now. But the government won't get any credit for arriving at that position because people will say, well, they didn't want that and they've been forced to it. So I think it's needless what they're doing here.
I also kind of get the, from this insistence on volunteering, I sort of get the impression that we're expecting from potential British residents and British citizens much more than we expect from people who were born here. We don't put an expectation for volunteering and contributing to the community on people who are born in the country. And yet people who are going to come and live here, and they are going to contribute because they're going to be paying taxes, are expected also to go above and beyond and be doing this nebulous volunteering. I just feel like the opportunity to beat up on migrants whenever you can is being taken.
I think this is where it's a bit vague. So I wouldn't read actually what they've said as being they're going to insist that everyone has to have done volunteering. I understand that's a perfectly legitimate interpretation. Yeah. I think it's people who, for example, haven't been in work and haven't, for whatever reason, haven't done anything else, might be asked to do some volunteering. But because they've been so vague, I think both of our interpretations of what's happening is, possible given what they've said. And, but I think they're probably going to get no credit for what they're saying on the right, and they're going to lose people to the left. I just can't see, I'm not a political strategist, but I can't quite see what their plan is here.
You identify a lot of strongly held beliefs about immigration that aren't necessarily borne out by facts. And one is that immigration grows economies. But you point out that it doesn't always grow productivity. Why is that? Can you set out for us why it doesn't?
Yes. So our normal measure of the size of an economy is what economists would call, GDP, just how much stuff we make in the economy. And basically, immigration increases population. More people means more stuff. So in that sense, it's growth. But actually, the growth that we're interested in is improving people's quality of life, which in the material sense is sort of growth, GDP per capita, per person. And then it's not inevitable that migration increases GDP per capita. So if, for example, we, say, liberalise the rules on hospitality, so it becomes easier to bring in migrant workers in hospitality. Hospitality is a very low wage, low productivity sector. So we're increasing the share of hospitality in our economy. But is that really what we want to do? Is that really what we want to do? Is that our path to prosperity? Of course, we need restaurants and things, but we also don't want our whole economy to be made up of restaurants. Again, we have to be finding, what's the right balance in here.
And another argument is that we need immigrants because our population is ageing and there simply won't be enough people of working age to support the number of retired people in the country. Does that stack up from an immigration point of view?
Not nearly as much as many people believe. Immigration, a high level of immigration will help a little bit with ageing, but not that much. And it's much more beneficial in the short run because you get a new migrant in the country, they're probably, 30 years old, so they're reducing the average age. But the problem is that they age at exactly the same rate as everybody else. So they're not going to be 30 forever. They're going to age. And so in the long run, the effect is much, much less beneficial. And so there have been some really excellent studies by the UN, the EU, the ONS here, going back, actually working out how much immigration would you need to, have a certain level of the dependency ratio and so on. And it's often really infeasibly large levels of migration to have that. So it helps a bit. It is an argument on the plus side for why we should have a little bit more migration. But the notion that we need very large levels of migration because of this is just really not supported by the evidence at all.
Interesting. And you're also quite concerned about the potential for student immigration to become a backdoor for people to either claim asylum or disappear. What should the visa offer for students post-graduation be? It's been quite generous, and because Boris Johnson brought in quite a generous post-graduation offer. What should it be, do you think?
I think it's right that we offer a pathway by which international students here who are sort of can get a good job here and then stay. But I think the problem was that some of the motivation for coming here is the education, and some of the motivation is the work rights that you might have either before or after graduation, and then the prospect of settling permanently. And our offer just got way out of balance, that basically we ended up in a situation where students would be prepared to come here, pay money for degrees that would be, even if they were totally worthless, just because the work rights meant it was financially attractive thing to do. And at that point, you basically got exactly what we saw, which is an explosion of numbers of students, and again, an unsustainable policy, so that we had this boom and then we had a bust.
And universities are now heavily dependent on international students because it's been postponing the inevitable day when we say, well, tuition fees aren't high enough.
Yes, so they've got they've become increasingly dependent on them. I should say that the numbers actually aren't down as much as you might read. So, they have fallen compared, let's say, to 1 or 2 years ago. They're still like 50% above where they were, before the pandemic. So they're still actually, you don't tend to hear that side of the story. So I would always say to people, if they're reading stories, think a little bit about where people are coming from, who are, what's their agenda here. If you can, go and have a look at some of the longer run statistics, try and get the other side of the story. And I think one of the problems is I'm not sure we do that quite enough.
Ross, there was this pretty strange story in the papers this week. Reform's only black branch chair quit the party, saying that Britain's migration debate was doing more harm than good. His name's Neville Watson. He's from North London. He said he hadn't personally experienced any racism in Reform, but he was worried about the encroachments of Christian nationalism and that British politics was losing its compassion. I mean, this is in the, he might not have experienced any racism within Reform, but there's been a fair bit of it visible on the outside of the party. I mean, is it ever going to be possible to separate what Alan talks about as a kind of, a sensible, non-heated debate on immigration from the fact that it's always going to be connected to racists who want to make it about race?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I wouldn't be entirely optimistic about this changing anything much in Reform. You may recall that Zia Youssef quit not long ago and a few days later was back at a very senior position in the party, although possibly that does act as a little bit of a corrective to Nigel Farage when he is considering how to position himself. But with Katie Lam of the Conservatives getting involved this week in this extraordinary way, that really changes the game. And as I say, that it really upends things because it has been Reform pulling the Conservatives to the right. Now we're saying Conservatives potentially pulling Reform to the right. It's important that people stand up and talk about, for example, the rise of Christian nationalism, because there is that big. Farage is getting a lot of money from the US and from Christian nationalists there, and we should be tracking that and we should be aware of it. And we should see how it has directly influenced his policy, not just on immigration, but on things like abortion, which it has.
We may be going into the next election with 3 of the 5 competing parties offering different levels of harshness towards migrants, particularly indefinite leave to remain. Reform and the Tories we know about, but Labour may also be trying to outbid them. What is the average "Oh God, what now" listener who is, almost certainly has a pretty relaxed attitude towards immigration? What are we supposed to do?
Well, I think they need to it's probably going to be at least 3 years until the next election or around that time. Things may look very different at that point. I think it's important not to jump to conclusions right now whether reform will continue to be popular and whether it may well be that the Conservatives and Reform will merge. And that rather puts a different spin on things as well. It means all kinds of different things for tactical voting. It means that if you are on the left, you will seriously have to consider how best to keep a Reform Tory coalition out of power. And you may have to compromise your principles a bit, and you may have to say, well, I realise Labour have been really tough on migration. I'm not happy about that, but my number one priority is keeping these guys out. And that certainly will be my priority when the next election comes around.
Alan, just to wrap up, if I had to sum up your book in a very short phrase, if I had to sum up what you're saying about taking the heat and the anger and the polarization out of the immigration debate, it would be make migration boring again.
Yes.
Make it. I think you talk about looking at it through a dull lens. Try and take the kind of emotive aspect of it out. If you can transmit just one thought probably to Keir Starmer, actually, because it's highly unlikely that Badenoch or Nigel Farage would want to listen on this particular score because it's been so fruitful for them. If you could get one thought into Keir Starmer's brain, what would it be?
Right now, it would be more clear about your plans on settlement quickly, and don't make it as bad as many people are fearing you will. I don't think he will, actually, personally.
So basically, make it clear that Labour isn't actually trying to outbid the Tories and Reform. It's trying to do something else with immigration.
Yes, I don't think it's accurate, personally, to think that they're trying to outbid. They're trying to bring the managed bits of migration down from levels that I think simply were too high. I think that is more or less accomplished, even though it'll take some time to come through, and people may not realise it yet. I think they do need to be focused on small boats and trying to get those numbers down. And then on settlement, I think what we'd probably end up with is really tweaks around our current system. So a little bit less generous than it is now, but I'm not sure the worst case scenarios that people are talking about is where they will end up. But maybe I'm over optimistic.
You never know. We've had more than one listener in touch saying, I really never want to hear about migration ever again. And maybe that's the goal, just like stop having to think about it. Well, after all that, we definitely need Escape Routes, the regular section where we talk about maybe new records, books or movies or TV or other works of entertainment and culture, high and low, that enable us to get out of the infernal cycle. Alan, how have you been keeping out the infernal cycle this week?
I must confess to a certain love for celebrity traitors that may undermine my credibility beforehand. But I'm not sure it meets your criteria, because
Why?
I think that all this sort of frenzied, incompetent search for finding the traitors actually reminds me of a lot of our politics when we're trying to find who's betrayed us. Is it the migrants? Is it the billionaires? And so on. But then again, it's different because actually there are real traitors in that program. Whereas in, the real world, I think perhaps in looking for the source of our woes, we should perhaps look to ourselves a bit more than to others.
Maybe the real traitors is us.
Perhaps.
Well,
that would be a twist. That would be a good plot twist.
You, the viewer, you're the traitor. Yeah, well, I guess when you're obsessed with politics, everything becomes politics, doesn't it? Ros, how about you?
Yeah, well, I've also been watching Celebrity Traitors. It is, as Alan says, it's an exercise in, which of you lying bastards is lying to me. But I expressed the view on A Blue Sky, naturally, that I wasn't much enjoying the Celebrity Traitors at all. And then I got asked to write a piece for A New World on why I wasn't enjoying Celebrity Traitors at all. And I've got a lot of hate for that, I have to say. People love Celebrity Traitors, and they do not understand my aversion to it. I have to say there's an element to it that I find compelling, but what I can't abide is the obsession with death. I mean, also the sheer triviality of what is actually going on. The people.
It is a game show.
People will leave, and it's like, oh my God, what have I done? I banished him. They've gone home and they've kicking back with a whiskey and booking the next Botox appointment. It's not some sort of and yet we have to amp it all up with this constant death. So the whole castle is full of these awful memento mori things, skulls, terrible paintings of ghosts and stuff. And then you had the really, I found, revolting thing in the first couple of episodes when 3 people had to lie in coffins, and then Claudia went round and snapped one shut on Paloma Faith. And there was something about that I thought, right, for me that has crossed a line. I confess I don't get the whole Halloween chic thing. I loathe it. I found it very, very unpleasant. You do not put people in coffins and then close the lids on them. That is not amusing and it is not clever. And then they all got in a procession wearing the most ridiculous mourning gear, including Tom Daly with his black shirt unbuttoned to his navel. It was just, I did not enjoy that.
Well, I am the last person on earth who's not watching Celebrity Traitors. I don't even know how the show works. My choice of escape route is a record, and it's called Compact Total 25. Compact is a German record label, and they make lovely, lovely techno music, lovely mind-massaging. Neil Tennant once called it music for listening to in the bath. And every year they put out a compilation, and they've been doing it for 25 years. And the one for 2025 is really good, and it has people on it with names like Robag Rumer and Wasserman and Jürgen Papp, all artists whom I love. Alexis Taylor from Hot Chip is on one track. It's just really lovely, self-elevating electronic music, and I've been buying these records for 25 years now, and this time of year I always feel wonderful because there's a new one out, and it's heartily recommended. That's Compact with 2 Ks. And that is the end of this edition. Thank you, Alan Manning, for coming in.
Thank you.
The book Why Immigration Policy is Hard and How to Make It Better is available shortly. And thank you, Ross Taylor.
Thank you.
The Future of Trust is also available right now. Listeners, thanks for listening. And extra special thanks if you're listening via Patreon, the crowdfunding platform that has kept Oh God What Now going for nearly 8 years now. Make a small contribution every month and you'll keep us in good shape. Plus you get every edition early and ad-free and our desirable merchandise. Keep an eye out for new refreshed designs coming soon. Follow the link in the show notes to find out how to back us. We would really appreciate it. Remember, if you're on Spotify, by the way, you can also watch our panel shows on video. Big shout to Rebecca Emily, who said, "This video freaks me out. Nobody looks like I've been imagining they did for the 3 years I've been listening. We are as God made us, Emily. This is all we've got." Thanks for listening or watching. We'll see you at the end of the week.